Hi, my name is Ashwin. I'm a cybersecurity evangelist at Checkpoint. There's a saying that you never let a serious crisis go to waste. With that in mind, today I'm going to share with you lessons learned from our incident response team, who last year alone received more than 3,000 calls for help globally from businesses that were either under an attack or had just been breached. My focus today are lessons from the various cloud breaches, because over the last couple of years, we've seen a huge increase in cloud-based attacks. These attacks come in many different forms, and I'll be covering some of them today in the hope that you don't make the same mistakes. It's really important that you listen to the case studies I'll be sharing with you today, because many of the organizations that had called our incident response team for help believed that they had good cyber strategy for cloud adoption. So the number one attack vector when it comes to cloud are SaaS platforms. To be more specific, Office 365 is where attackers are focusing. Phishing attacks are nothing new here. We've seen attacks that have led to millions of dollars of loss. We've seen attacks that targeted intellectual properties, as well as nation-state threat actors using Office 365 infrastructure for their advantage. These attacks have been going on for years, yet there are so many businesses that still don't know how to deal with it. Let's take a deeper look at a recent SaaS attack our team dealt with. Our incident response team received a call for assistance for investigating a very large transfer of money from a CFO. We started our investigation with the email system because typically that's where we see a lot of these types of attacks start. One of the first things we identified was the communication pattern between this organization and one of their suppliers. The victim started the transaction with a supplier, and this conversation was conducted over many different emails. And we noticed during the conversation that there were changes in the dialogue and the conversation between the supplier and the victim. And we noticed that the attacker had inserted themselves in the conversation and was subtly manipulating the dialogue between the two parties. Now, this went on for a while. We also noticed that within their Office 365 instance, someone was actually creating new accounts, new mailboxes to imitate someone that they're not. We started to dig deeper to find out exactly what was the root cause of the attack. By understanding the root cause, you can understand the attacker's techniques, tactics, and procedures, and their capability. Basically, it gives you a fingerprint of the attack. So our incident response team dug, and what they found was really interesting. The victim actually had a huge amount of security around the Office 365 instance. They had multi-factor authentication, they had logging, they had all kinds of additional security controls around email flow. They were utilizing external email filters. We didn't see that the attacker actually used any of the credentials of any of the employees, which is typically how we see these types of attacks play out. What we found was that the actual entry point for the attack was the partner account. One of the capabilities of Office 365 is the ability for partners to manage customer instances. And we identified that one of the partner admin had been phished. Someone had emailed them and convinced them to actually share their multi-factor authentication token. The attacker then logged in as the partner and started manipulating mailboxes. The attacker not only changed the Office 365 instances, but also started spinning up additional infrastructure inside Azure. It's vitally important that you understand that attackers are looking for every avenue into any of your SaaS-based applications. And it's important you take this into consideration, because you really don't know who has access to your instances unless you are checking constantly. So one of the big things that we saw last year was partner or supply chain being infiltrated by attackers. So it's critically important that you take this attack vector into consideration. Constantly evaluate who has access to your instance. What are the things that you want to authorize a partner to be able to work on? Do you want them to have the capability to turn on instances? Do you want them to be able to change your Office 365 configuration? And Office 365 is just the tip of the iceberg. We started looking at other systems. So for example, video conferencing systems such as WebEx has the ability for partners to be able to manage their customer instances. It's not just a Microsoft problem, but it's really a software as a service methodology, especially when partners are involved in the delivery of some of these services. So make a concerted effort to identify those partners and make sure to exercise principle of least privilege. And you want to make sure that your partners are utilizing the highest level of security, because it does daisy chain. We've seen attacks against Salesforce as well as Azure AD. All of these key services are being heavily targeted by attackers to be able to use those applications to either steal information, manipulate victims, or financially try to extort as much as possible. The interesting thing also is that ransomware plays into this whole dialogue too. So even though cloud may not be directly related to to every ransomware attack that you see, it has a component. For example, Office 365 is a component. Azure can be a component. Even a S3 bucket and SharePoint can be components. Any element that's within the cloud can be used by attackers as an avenue of delivery, manipulation, or injection. So take all of these things into consideration and don't go blindly. One of the biggest lessons that we've learned over the last 5 years of working cloud incidents is that most businesses just assume someone else is going to do security for them in the cloud. And this cannot be further from the truth. There are newer ways of doing security, but it is still your responsibility. Another type of attack that we saw prevalent in 2020 was infrastructure-based attacks within cloud. Basically, where you would have an application front-ended by a load balancer or a web server or web infrastructure, which then becomes an extension of your environment or your DMZ into the cloud, and typically managed by the customers themselves. But what we found is that most customers make the exact same mistakes that they do in their traditional infrastructure. They have faster ways of doing stuff, but what they also do is make exactly the same mistakes that they did inside their DMZ. So what are some of these mistakes? The first one is patching. Multiple times in 2020, we were called to respond to incidents where the web server or infrastructure that was managed by the victim had been compromised. And it was 9 out of 10 times something as stupid as Bitcoin miner. What we are seeing, our attackers are using exactly the same method as they've been using for the last 30 or 40 years of the internet, which is to look for vulnerable services, exploit them, and utilize them for their own gain. We've seen web servers, database servers, S3 buckets being compromised and used for nefarious things. All of them center around either patching because the services are vulnerable, or configuration. And infrastructure as a service is really one of those areas where we found huge amount of misconfigurations. Most customers don't appreciate just how much change there really is going on in their cloud infrastructure. We are starting a managed detection and response service here at Checkpoint. And one of the things that we did was turn on our cloud monitoring and posture management product set. And what we saw very quickly was just how dynamic customer environments were, with tearing down, spinning up, and manipulating cloud infrastructure. It's really very dynamic. What we also found was that customers are making simple mistakes. They're making the same mistakes over and over again, basic configuration mistakes. Bad permissions, wrong configuration around services, very weak encryption or API keys, and this just keeps going on and on. In one of the attacks, we saw an S3 bucket that had very loose permissions. It was basically read-only permission for a web server, and the attacker was able to find a vulnerability in the web server and get access to the S3 bucket. That is a classic kind of misunderstanding of some of the security controls that might follow a service from one section of your environment into another. And we see this a lot. And in this case, the attacker was able to steal hundreds of thousands of sensitive records. These kinds of attacks, especially around infrastructure services, are so difficult to understand unless you have a visualization tool and a control mechanism to understand the bigger picture around all of your cloud infrastructure. It's vitally important that you get your hand around this dynamic environment to understand how Azure, AWS, and GCP interrelate to the delivery of these services. And in a multi-cloud environment, which I suspect most of you have, the chance of security oversight just amplifies. So utilize a tool that can help you visualize and understand all of the threats and misconfigurations around your entire cloud infrastructure, and understand where those configuration issues are and deal with it. Look for tools that will automatically remediate misconfigurations. I cannot stress the importance of this. Make sure that as you're shifting left, you understand all the consequences to that environment and all the pitfalls that occur there. Okay, now to one of the worst examples of moving too quickly into the cloud. We had a business contact us and say that they've had complete data breach across all of their environment, and they wanted our help in figuring out what had happened. And what we were able to determine was that the attacker infiltrated a service that was hosted inside AWS. It had fairly tight controls, except for one mistake, and that mistake was to allow an admin panel access to the internet. The attacker was able to access the admin panel, get root on the server, and started mapping out how they could move laterally inside the environment. They were able to determine very quickly that there was actually a database connection all the way back across the VPN into the corporate environment. The attacker then wrote the connection to the database server. They were able to utilize the same credentials that they had stolen from the server to access the database server. All they did was reverse engineer the password and then move laterally inside the environment, and were able to actually extort the customer for a very large sum from a ransomware attack. We traditionally see these type of attacks in Microsoft environment, but we are seeing more and more of these attacks being able to do this, attackers being able to do the same thing inside Unix environments too. It's also really important to take into consideration all of the legacy infrastructure inside of these infrastructure connections, because it plays directly into the hands of the attackers. So if your Active Directory permissions are weak, it will have a cascading effect across every other component of your infrastructure, especially if you're using Windows AD as a primary source of authentication. So take this into consideration, that your legacy infrastructure will and can be used as another avenue of attack inside your environment. We had one organization call us and say, hey, why is my intranet app on the internet? And within 10 minutes, we were able to tell them that the instance wasn't private, it was public, and they didn't realize that the developer had put it in the wrong area within AWS, and it was completely open to the internet. And again, it is really important that you focus on these infrastructure configuration issues and make sure that you understand how they relate to your specific environments. One of the things we're finding within the cloud is that we have these new paradigms continuously coming out: SASE, SD-WAN, and all of these serverless stuff. Our incident response team typically sees where areas where there's most attacks, most friction. One of the things that we haven't seen is a huge amount of attacks or huge number of serverless attacks, so function level attacks. But that doesn't mean that we have not seen telltale signs of those attacks. Recently, we were engaged with a very large incident, and we started unraveling the attacker's history within this environment. And what we saw was that at one moment in time, the attacker was inside the legacy infrastructure of the victim. We saw that the attacker was crawling across various different systems, and they were looking for very specific things. Now, obviously, they were looking for that database with all the records, but that's obvious. And but the thing is that they were also looking for something else. They were looking for API keys. And we're seeing attackers looking for those API keys a lot more these days. And they're looking for keys that give them a huge amount of access to your environment, specifically GitHub keys, admin permission API keys, programmatic API keys, and any of the keys for your customized application. There's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of those keys lying around, and there really isn't a lot of hygiene or good practice around these key usage. So make sure that you have a plan on how to take care of those API keys. Don't just assume that the application owners are going to help you with this. You have a responsibility to protect those keys and to make sure that you're protecting it at the same level as your root ID or your super user account. So make a concerted effort to understand those API keys and how they're being used. It could be the difference between an attacker having access to your infrastructure or not, or having access to your application or not. We've seen attackers use API keys to stand up additional infrastructure within Azure. We saw an attacker steal the keys, start a Terraform script, and turn up infrastructure such as web servers and SharePoint servers. In one case, we saw the attacker place a malware inside of a SharePoint environment and then more than likely have it as a delivery mechanism for additional attacks. So we're seeing attackers utilize cloud infrastructure just like you would. They use it for very targeted attacks, and they even do very specific geo-based protection around this infrastructure or this hacked infrastructure because they're getting the infrastructure for free at your expense. So if your API keys are compromised, attackers will be able to do whatever they want with your cloud infrastructure. Now, another cloud-related attack that we see are against SD-WAN. Businesses are racing towards SD-WAN and not fully understanding the architecture behind it. We've worked a number of cases where businesses have assumed that they have security controls, but in reality have none. So the typical deployment for these environments are where customers have maybe 5 or 6 different sites around the world, each of them with a little device that connects with a tunnel to the SD-WAN node and creates a mesh network across the internet. Well, what they also don't really understand is that none of their networks are segmented. They have basically a full flat network without multiple zones of protection. And essentially what they've done is recreated all the same mistakes that they've had in their data center, but now increasing the size of their flat network. They either don't fully understand the technology or they just didn't appreciate the fact that segmentation is still pretty darn vital in our architecture today. So as you're rushing to these environments, especially in 2021, where cloud becomes sort of the go-to for application-based infrastructure, service-based and function-based cloud infrastructure, make sure that you take that extra time to understand that you might be taking a step backward from security and not a step forward. There really are two key concepts to any security in my mind, and that is visibility and control. So make sure you have both as you embrace all that cloud has to offer. So to wrap up, as you're moving to the cloud, make sure you have visibility and control as you utilize these new services. Understand how new cloud services actually impact your security internally. Take the time to architect and design, and most importantly, understand what you're actually moving towards instead of just rushing. Remember, your legacy infrastructure can also be an avenue for attacks. And finally, make sure you understand the risks of who has access to your cloud and how much capability they have to make changes within your cloud. Really important you are in control, because these areas are very dynamic, and a single slip up can cost your organization dearly. Folks, my details are on the screen. Please reach out to me if you would like to have a conversation around how we can help you secure your cloud environment. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.